Welcome to this episode of Abide in Me, How Jesus Models Secure Attachment with God. This series is a survey of the Gospel of Mark, looking for how Jesus models what is now called secure attachment, which is the physiological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual experience of what is often called salvation or regeneration or being conjoined with God or enlightenment, individuation, even becoming spiritual. Through the series, we will discover the benefits of becoming securely attached with God, which is the transformation of one's life into one of joy and satisfaction. In Mark chapter 7, the chapter finishes with two miracles modeling three characteristics of a securely attached person. First is unconditional regard for another person who is an other, not like me, a person not in my tribe or social milieu, my neighborhood or race or class or so forth. Second, Jesus models the way to fully attend to another person. And finally, he promotes a life of self-observation rather than self-promotion to become that emotionally transparent, securely attached person that we want to be for our loved ones. In the first story, a Syrian woman, not from Israel, shows up to ask for healing for her daughter. Now, at first reading, it sounds like Jesus labels her a dog, but not so. I am presuming that as a securely attached person as he is, he never needs to put another person down to assert his value or rightness or privilege. So that leads me to realize that maybe he is looking around and acknowledging that the people around him, unified by their nation and religion, consider this outsider as an other, less than they, not worthy to be treated equally, and be willing to only share the scraps of their privilege with her. He's calling them out for not caring for someone because they are not in their clan. Her response to Jesus' acknowledgement of the reality is spot on and displays her own sense of intrinsic self-worth and dignity by acknowledging that while not being among her tribe, she welcomes and is grateful for whatever she does receive. So I see Jesus here modeling how to be in a relationship with someone not like me. Now pause here for a moment. Remember a beloved pet you had as a child? Or a best friend who shared adventures and secrets? Or perhaps you are blessed with a friend or relative or spouse with whom you have a deep bond of friendship. Perhaps you are in a homeowners association that conditions you to wave at your neighbors, even though you have no idea who they are, because you are in the same association. You may not make any judgment about them based on what they look like or their first language because they're in your neighborhood. They're part of the group. In those circumstances, there's already a foundation for a connection based on some external shared circumstance. You have an expectation that your feelings, your ideas, your values, your needs, your wants will be shared and felt and seen and heard and accommodated to by this person that you otherwise don't know. You presume that other person will be with you in joy and in fear and ordeal and sorrow, even in upset, maybe shared anger at the association's management, right? So it is easy to look at a person in my tribe or culture with love, and there are some circumstances in which that culture, that tribe, can be based on merely external circumstances. I imagine that when Jesus came to town, the locals who believed he could heal them and their loved ones, when they met him, felt safe in his presence. They felt welcomed, even if they had come acknowledging their sinfulness, which was their sickness, right? And then there shows up a woman from another country, and she asks for healing for her daughter. He immediately welcomes her, acknowledging the stretch she's making to seek a cure for her daughter. That allows Jesus to immediately bond with her in the fear and anguish at a child being possessed by a devil, in this case. He was acknowledging the reality that he, in this moment, shared with a woman who was very conscious of her lack of standing in his world, this distress. Much of our work in the world, for most of us, is not inside our family, right? It's outside our family. And there's this wonderful book by the Reverend Paul Vickers, Person to Person, the Gospel of Mark. And he points out that much of the way our life affects others is actually decided in those areas outside of our home, where there may be very little shared, deeper beliefs and attitudes. And we could characterize that as being a dog's life, right? I'm out there working and there's people around. And as Reverend Vickers points out, you cannot take the children's bread, as Jesus called it, and apply it directly to those folks in those other areas of life. And yet, like the woman, we must recognize that our outward life needs the crumbs of acceptance, of welcome, and goodwill that fall from this table of a shared faith. That's the role we want to play. When we go out into the surrounding worldly rat race and wrestle with its problems, we seem to be in an area that can hardly feed on those high principles. Although the structure of society and economics and business practice may seem to be driven solely by self-interest or greed or materialism, maybe it's lacking any thought of loving service, our behavior in those circumstances can still be caring, valuing, honoring others. That might not be seen in those circumstances. Those circumstances can hardly be nurtured by our high principles. But when we concentrate on the service we can give, rather than the money we can make or the status we can gain, we can maintain truly human relationships with our colleagues, and with customers, and so forth. Now, we come to this way of being by observing why we judge others different from us as somehow less than us. As we observe that from this place of security of being loved by God, being lovable, we are able to love. As we observe what we're doing, we can discover if there is a fear of that other person precisely because they are different and so unknown, which is, we are wired to be wary of the unknown, right? So that's always going to be there. But the resolution is to follow Jesus' model and cultivate an inner view of oneself as worthy, because that worth is inherent in us. And so we do not need to be defensive to maintain it or aggressive to establish it when someone who is other than us comes into our world. Wise people through the ages have taught us that there's this wonderful benefit that comes from trusting that our life, our power, our value, our goodness, our identity all come from God, from the divine, from the source, from the universe, and not from ourselves or from the world. Because by practicing that, we can, like Jesus and others, turn towards that stranger, see them as human and as human as I am, and serve them from a love and compassion for them. That's the lesson of this miracle of the healing of the Syrian woman's daughter. The second miracle of Mark 7 illustrates two characteristics of being a securely attached person. In the story, it's notable that Jesus decided to go from Tyre to Sidon to Decapolis, which takes him around the Sea of Galilee. That is a circuitous route from Tyre to Decapolis. It's a long journey for Jesus and his retinue. We can imagine many days and nights of walking, seeking shelter, seeking food, and so some ordeal that they take together. And then along the way, talking together, probably seeing miracles done, and bonding over the hardships of travel, and the sharing of life stories, managing the crowds of people petitioning Jesus for healing. We can imagine that amongst Jesus and his immediate followers, those 12, and then the people that were along with them, we can imagine those relationships were getting stronger and stronger. We now call that becoming securely attached, right? Because they become connected. Their anxiety is diminishing. Their knowing of each other is increasing. They're experiencing safe connections with each other. They're seeing each other going through the same ordeals. So their minds and hearts are becoming calmer, and feeling more tuned into each other and to Jesus. What we know from psychology happens then is that we are able to accept new ideas, and we're able to be humble when challenged. The story we read here teaches us two lessons on how to establish secure attachments in our relationships. First, Jesus models the way to fully attend to another person. And secondly, he promotes a life of self-observation rather than self-promotion. And the way the apostles receive these lessons is a wonderful illustration of how our trusting relationships will indeed lead to our accepting of the transformative experience that we're being offered. So first, a deaf and mute man is brought to Jesus by a group of people. And he takes that man aside, showing him individual attention and consideration for the man's feelings, not in the crowd, but on his own. The man was likely had a life's experience of being rejected because of his condition. Now, previously, Jesus fed thousands of people in one miracle, and then a crowd watched as he brought Lazarus back to life. But there are many instances like this in which a miracle happens in relative privacy. So I see Jesus here modeling giving full attention to the person I'm with, including seeing their disabilities. That is, in this case, the inability to hear other people's love for them because of their own woundedness, being deaf, and their inability to manifest, to say how they feel because their woundedness blocks their consciousness of their emotions. They are mute. So perhaps you know people that are like that, or that are wounded like that. A secure attachment with that person, which will result in the healing of your relationship, can be created only by attending to the whole person, disabilities and all, accepting them as they are, while I model transparency and respect and compassion and presence. That's what Jesus was doing. And as tall an order as that may sound, it is a model we need to aspire to. Deafness symbolizes what our life is like when we do not know the truth. And that is not uncommon. Perhaps we misunderstood a principle our teachers were trying to instill in us in our childhood, right? So we don't know it. Perhaps we were lied to as we grew from infancy to childhood. Or perhaps childhood trauma created a false narrative that protected our spirit, but now needs to be heard and seen for what it is, which is merely a defense mechanism. But we don't know that. So that's not knowing the truth for one reason or another. That's being deaf. An example might be a person becoming arrogant because they were encouraged to believe their creed was the one true faith, right? What starts as a positive assertion of a tribe's identity eventually becomes an arrogant exclusivity that demeans other people's beliefs. That person's not living the truth. They don't know the truth. They're deaf. Another example would be a person who thinks poorly of themselves because they were repeatedly lied to, for instance, being told they were stupid or unworthy of love. So they are ignorant of the inherent value of their own spirit. They are deaf to it. Perhaps the worst case is when a child is abused, and then the brain and the mind actually create barriers that protect the spirit of that human being, but at the same time, unfortunately, block any consciousness of emotions or a healthy sense of self. That's being deaf. And perhaps you know someone who is like one of these ways, right? We know from modern psychology, I happen to know from professional and personal experience, that a safe, secure, emotionally transparent relationship miraculously heals all these diseases of the heart and the mind and the body. Such a relationship can be established, perhaps in a few weeks, perhaps it takes years. But what's required is my giving attention to that person as they are here and now. So when we adopt Jesus' model in our individual relationships, healing happens for ourselves and for our loved one, for the other person. And it's not because we have some superpower or are tremendously wise. It is that just like Jesus, all we have is love, which is, we know, actually God's love, the divine love, the unconditional flow of life. And we simply become a means for the flow of that love through us out into the world, where open hearts and minds, opened by giving attention and caring and compassion, that those open hearts and minds will be touched and healed. There's a second, perhaps less obvious lesson we get from this story, symbolized by Jesus' plea that everyone keeps this miracle to themselves. I've long wondered why Jesus repeatedly makes this plea in the Gospels. I've heard plenty of answers. But now here's one that really makes the most complete sense to me, which is evident from looking at Jesus as a securely attached person. It describes how one part of our own spiritual journey following Jesus' model is to be able to become that emotionally transparent and securely attached person that we want to be for our loved ones. Jesus knows the fallen, frail, fallible human condition that we are all in because he was living it. And he was illustrating what an intimate relationship with the Creator, his Father, the source of life, what that does for us. When that unconditional, unlimited love calls us to transformation, we therefore implicitly know, however conscious we are of it or not, that there is no end to the possibilities of healing and spiritual growth for us. We then gain a strong sense of self-worth, which is actually selfless. Now, this inner perception brought about by this transformation cannot actually be shared with others. Everyone needs to go through the ordeal to discover it on their own. We certainly can describe it to others. We can encourage others to seek it, but each individual has their own transformation. So back to the story. All the people saw that all Jesus did was good. All that he did was good. And of course, they were excited about it and happy about it. The phrase they use is reported in the Gospel of Mark, harkens back to the Garden of Eden. But before evil and disabilities had been introduced into the world, they felt it in their hearts and their bodies. So of course they would want to tell their relatives and friends, the Messiah has come at last. They felt they were on the verge of freedom from the occupying Romans, right? And on the verge of full membership in the church that had become elitist, that had become impossible to be part of. I imagine many of them would shout, "Look at me, look at what Jesus has done for me. You can have it too." That would be the natural urge. And Jesus is telling them, don't do it, right? Jesus must have experienced that urge because we all do. The problem is that inevitably our fallen and wounded natures will drift from promoting the message of this healing to promoting the messenger. Look at me. I believe Jesus noticed this happening within himself. He could have called attention to himself, and yet again and again, he was stopping people from doing that. Yet based on his assurance of being loved, and based on his trust in the divine plan for his life, he stopped the thought. He acknowledged the urge. He observed the process. He went through the temptation ordeal and then felt free to let go, even though he still wanted to promote himself. He saw that was not transformation. That was not regeneration. It was merely proclaiming a message, an idea, not living it. We are told in the rest of the story that he felt this urge every moment of his life, deep in his spirit, because the last thing he says as he dies, he says, "Into your hands I commend," or release, "my spirit." He had to let it go. And that need to promote himself was an urge of his to the very end. So too, we will always have the urge to promote ourselves and our spiritual advancement. It feels so good to our egos, especially when we have made advances, right? And we know some things and we could tell people, right? The urge is there simply because we are living in the world. The task of transformation is to be able, with love and transparency and sense of safety to rise above those urges and see ourselves as beloved of God, beloved by others, and so able to love others. This is the universal experience of the path of spiritual growth. The key is to be, like Jesus, aware of it, so that we are not unconsciously driven into that mere self-promotion. We all have our system of thinking. We have our emotional processing that's always running in the background of our unconscious life. That's the human condition. And that thought process and that emotional processing condition us to then behave in a certain way. We all learn to obey the rules of these systems, and we do obey them, even if that internal system is broken or corrupted by trauma or by evildoers. So the task is to become conscious, or as Jesus said, awake. Emanuel Swedenborg calls it self-examination. George Gurdjieff calls it self-remembering. Many wise sages call it mindfulness. In any case, whatever it's called, whatever is your experience, in the story we read, it is about this internal awareness of what just happened and how it impacts us and what we can do with it and how we can live from that lesson of now being able to hear and speak, as it were. Jesus models an attitude of continuing self-observation practice by people who feel secure in their relationship with their Creator, with themselves, and with others. Of course, we want to share our insights with our loved ones, and we do. However, we must be aware that our merely naturally minded human condition leads us ever so gradually, inevitably, to become arrogant spokespeople for our truth, or fixated merely on the story and not on the obedience to the lesson of the story. So let us be awake and conscious and self-aware, remembering, mindful. That secure attachment to God through living the model of Jesus gives us in the Gospels will transform us, will regenerate us, so that we will not only hear the voice of love and wisdom of the universe, we will be able to helpfully and effectively share it with others. I pray this has supported your transformative life, whatever practice you have in your life. I want to thank Solomon Keel for his music, and I want to invite you to make a contribution to this work if you wish and are able through the PayPal link. And I invite you to continue to listen to the next episode. You be well.